So then we have this final whole scene panorama almost that concludes the story. So the story's resolution comes not necessarily from the plot dynamic of the individual characters, but from the narrative perspective itself. It resolves by returning to that broader angle shot that we began in the exposition. So the resolution of this story is one of a resolution of perspective, that we come back to a broader picture rather than the intensity of an individual consciousness. And so we begin again with this impressionistic aesthetic that Woolf opens the story with. Thus, one couple after another, with much the same irregular and aimless movement, passed the flower bed and were enveloped in layer after layer of green blue vapour, in which at first their bodies had substance and a dash of colour, but later both substance and colour dissolved in the green blue atmosphere. This incredibly powerful colour imagery deliberately conflates people in the scene with the butterflies and dragonflies that we've seen moving around. And so we've got here the irregular and aimless movement of the people, which mirrors the way that the butterflies and dragonflies have moved throughout the scene, throughout the story. And then they're enveloped in layer after layer of green blue vapor. So we've got this synesthetic imagery of sight and smell and tactile imagery. We've got the sight of the colours and then the vapor, I think the tactile imagery of vapor, and then being enveloped in it as a perhaps a tactile image as well. This sensory admixture that blurs very deliberately the boundary between people and nature, in which at first their bodies had substance and a dash of colour, so they seem and substance and colour dissolved in the green blue atmosphere. And this is almost as if the people themselves dissolve into the atmosphere of natural vitality of the gardens themselves. How hot it was, so hot that even the thrush chose to hop like a mechanical bird in the shadow of the flowers, with long pauses between one movement and the next. So this figurative language again, I think, collapses the distinction between nature almost and the human construction. So we've got a reverse here, and this is what we'll see is a gradual reversal back to human interference and technology in this case. Nature takes on the form of a mechanical bird. Instead of rambling vaguely, the white butterflies danced one another above one another. And so we've got, again, a slightly more purposeful movement on nature. And I think the hierarchy is subverted here because nature is the thing that takes precedence here, making with their white shifting flakes the outline of a shattered marble column above the tallest flowers. And I think this metaphor, gives us a sense of nature constructing human controversies in shattered fragmentary form, like the shattered fragments of civilization that are about to occur through the First World War. And this is where this looming shadowy context impinges on the scene of this particular text in a way that it hasn't so far. The glass roofs of the Palm House shone as if a whole market full of shiny green umbrellas had opened in the sun, and in the drone of the aeroplane the voice of the summer sky murmured its fierce soul. So the beauty here of the scene itself, the whole market full of shiny green umbrellas, is actually the building in the botanical gardens filled with green plants. And there's again a blurring of the distinction between human creation and natural creation. We've got the building itself as if it's a human creation, but a palm house. And then inside, the plants are described as a whole market full of shiny green umbrellas. And those metaphors there carry out that blurring of the human and natural creations. In the drone of the airplane, the voice of the summer sky murmured its fierce soul. And so again, there's this blurring where we've got a human construction, the aeroplane, but it's the voice of the summer sky that's speaking through it, and it's its fierce soul. There's a sort of warning, I think, inside the voice of this aeroplane, as if nature is moaning about the mindless destruction that is taking on, that is being carried out at the same moment in time elsewhere. Yellow and black, pink and snow white shapes of all these colours, men, women and children, were spotted for a second upon the horizon. And so we've got this sort of impressionistic dabs of colour that represent the scene itself and the people adopting it. And we've got this kind of Cézanne-like vision of the scene itself, of the impressions brought together. And then, seeing the breadth of yellow that lay upon the grass, they wavered and sought shade beneath the trees, dissolving like drops of water in the yellow-green atmosphere, staining it faintly with red and blue. And so they've got this very bold, sort of panoramic vision of the scene, and where individual people are now reduced to sort of daubs of colour, like a painting. It seemed as if all gross and heavy bodies had sunk down in the heat, motionless, and lay huddled upon the ground, but their voices went wavering from them as if they were flames lolling from the thick waxen bodies of candles. And so here there's, I think, a loss of the attempt to carry out person-to-person communication. And here individual life and individual consciousness dissolves into the phenomenon of perception. So the phenomenology of the scene is the final subject, rather than the individual relationships between the people. And this final metaphor, as their voices, as if they're flames lolling from thick waxen bodies of candles, means that the voice itself becomes sensory pleasure and perception, rather than listening to the actual communicative possibilities of those voices. And that's what's developed here. They're voices. Yes, voices, wordless voices, breaking the silence. And there's something oxymoronic about this, that voices are wordless and that they then break the silence. And I think what we see there is this profound sensory experience that is not so important from this perspective of communication, but is important from the perspective of the perception of human vitality. The consciousness that is seeing the scene becomes the subject, rather than the relationships taking place within it. Suddenly, with such depth of contentment, such passion of desire, or in the voices of children, such freshness of surprise. It's all of that whole panorama of human and emotional experiences that's trying to be rendered here. Breaking the silence, but there was no silence. So there is a deliberate sort of a sense of contradiction and antithesis in this question and answer. And I think a loss of control over this momentary panorama of human experiences as a final image is the intrusion of the technological transformation of the 20th century. All the time, the motor omnibuses were turning their wheels and changing their gear. And so again, we have this final image of technology and the city intruding upon this great panorama of natural and human emotion. Like a vast nest of Chinese boxes, all of wrought steel, turning ceaselessly one within another, the city murmured. And the syntax here gives us this final personification of the city after all of these sensory reminders of its chaotic noise, which is constructed within this simile, that the city is like a vast nest of Chinese boxes, with some things existing in such close proximity to one another, the cars and the passengers, as if they are one inside of the other. And they're all of wrought steel, turning ceaselessly one within the other. So there's a sense of relentless chaotic movement. And then a very sort of almost anticlimactic final phrase, in the sense that the city murmured, and that it's a reminder of its chaotic presence, on top of which the voices cried aloud and the petals of myriad flowers flashed their colours into the air. So there's this tiny glimpse of sensory vitality that concludes the story in this sort of burst of colour and emotion, but no one is actually watching, because the city scene is on top of this natural one. But I think there's this final, almost as if we're layering a sensory perceptive cake here. But it's the voices that cry aloud and the petals of flowers flashing their colours into the air that ends this sensory layering that Woolf uses in the resolution of this particular story.